the difference between parts work and IFS is the inclusion of the self to part connection is where the healing is. And so there are other ways to identify parts in EMDR, and then it's like beautiful therapist parts trying to get those other parts to behave in certain ways so the work can be healing, versus really giving space for the parts and what they're feeling to have a sense of self, a sense that there is a wise, strong, spacious leader inside that's really indescribable.
In this video, I am talking with Seiler and Karby Allington-Goldfain about the integration of EMDR and IFS. Sue and Karby are both EMDR and IFS consultants, and they have a really beautiful way to bring these two approaches together. In the video, Sue spends much of the time showing a visual of the different parts and their roles, and really linking it in a very effective way to what we do in EMDR. So if you want to learn more about EMDR and IFS and how to integrate these two approaches, this video is for you. So I want to officially welcome you to the EMDR learning community. Sue Seiler and Karby Allington-Goldfain, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
And we're talking about EMDR today, about the integration of EMDR and IFS. And I want to ask, these are two very powerful and effective approaches, and the integration of the two approaches make it even more powerful and more effective. What is it about the integration of EMDR and IFS that makes it so effective?
You know, I'll take that one. It's when we understand what we're actually working with, because we're understanding what part we're with, what parts, plural, we're with, then we can apply the EMDR process so much more effectively. Then when we hit a block, we know we're working with a part, and we come to that part and we relationship with that part instead of trying to get rid of it or get around it or push. Or IFS is a highly relational model. And so it creates a continual relationshiping between the client and the parts within them, and also parts to part relationship. And then us as the therapist, we are also part of that dance and part of that mix. And so as we're holding parts of our client as well, it creates such relationship, and it's highly attachment healing.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So I want to kind of dive into the parts and the different kind of parts and their different roles and the different interactions. And Sue, you shared with us a visual, an infographic that I shared with the group yesterday. And you can go ahead and share your screen and then maybe tell us about these parts and about how they interact with each other. And
Got it. Yeah. So keep in mind as we do this that it's all parts relating with other parts and parts relating with the person. As I go through this, see if you're able to stay in your body and feel into where your own parts are that might be represented on this infographic. So this just gives us a very basic structure of what's really happening, sort of like the foundation of a house, and then what happens on top of that foundation. So at the bottom, we have what are called exiles, and they typically are very young. They are parts of us that carry our wounds, our traumas, our hurts, oftentimes they are stuck in the past, and that becomes a really integral aspect of this work. So the exiles carry themes around our value. So if you hear from a client, I'm just never going to be good enough, or I'm unworthy, or, no one will love me, things like that, you can get super curious around, is that being held in a really young part? Because often those things are held in these very young exiles. So an interesting thing too about the exiles is that you can often pick up on them because you'll hear things from your client that sound young. Like if a client says, I'm really scared, feel into those words. That's what a younger child often says, as opposed to, boy, I'm just feeling a lot of fear about this. So listen carefully to the verbiage that's being used too. That can help. As IFS therapists, we call it our parts detector on. And so we're always feeling into and noticing different parts. So over here on the left side are some more traits of the exiles. When you think about our core beliefs, that is often held with exiles, not always, but often. They are often stuck in the past. So if I have a 5-year-old little girl part that's stuck in a difficult scene from my childhood, the energy around the feeling of that scene will be present in me today as an adult. And so as you start to notice those types of energies, we're working with highly traumatized people or somewhat traumatized people. And you often hear stories that are not accurate for the client, but that's because it's coming from a part that is stuck in the past. So good to notice that. These parts often carry shame too. So when I feel into shame within myself or with a client, I get real curious about if it's being held in an exile. So keep your parts detector going for the shame, aspects of shame. Self-loathing, low sense of self, unlovability, unworthiness, not good enough. Those are all things around value. And in, I don't want to say all cases, but in a lot of cases, when we hear things around value, it is being held in the exiles. So then what our system does, which is pretty lovely, I think, is we develop protectors. And the protectors protect the exiles from further wounding, or they try to. They aren't always successful. From further wounding, they try to protect us from feeling the discomfort held in the exiles, like shame. And so protectors, a couple of things about protectors that are really important is that they always have positive intention for us and for our system. Here's the thing with that, though, is that they don't always do things that we as grown-ups, as adults, say, well, that's not helpful to me. Think about substance abuse. That is very much a protective action. It is trying to achieve something in the system to gain greater comfort, and it's actually hurting the client, but they don't know that. They aren't aware of that. So protectors are quite unsophisticated, and that's not a negative. They always have positive intent for the person and the system. And this is where the whole concept with IFS of welcoming all parts are welcome, is so important. Because when you really get to know a part that appears to be perhaps really damaging, like if we take a suicidal part and we really get to know a suicidal part, oh my goodness, you will hear the positive intention in that part. And interestingly, in in my work with suicidal parts with clients, I have yet to come upon a suicidal part that understands that if the client went through with the plan, the suicidal plan, that the person would be dead and gone forever. Every single suicidal part I've worked with has been so surprised by that, which is such an indication that they really do have positive intention and how unsophisticated they are. So you can think of protectors as defenses. I think that helps a lot to think about, oh, even when you feel in a client where all of a sudden they start to get more defensive, what part was that just said that? We will often say to clients, who just said that? Feel into that. Where did that come from in or around your body? And then we can get to know the part. So, two different styles of protectors, the managers. They're on board 24/7. They organize, they keep our calendar, they keep us on time. They're the planners. They're beautiful. And then the firefighters, which can be more reactive and impulsive, and they create spontaneity. They can create passion and the fun. So they're beautiful too. Now, when these protectors overwork, that's where we get into trouble. So I once had a part of me that it was a protector part that was a very hard worker. It was an overworker. It was working to try to protect parts within me that were carrying not good enough, themes of lack of value. So this manager felt that if I worked harder, if I had more clients, then that would boost my value. Well, it doesn't. But its intention was solid and was in positive intention for me. So it is only when protectors are overworking that they can become problematic. So just notice within yourself right now, some of your own might be a behavior, might be a defense, might be something that you just do, and start to get curious about it. How might it be protecting something within you? And bring warmth and compassion to these parts as well. So then what happens with this work, with this healing work, we're often first greeted with the protectors. Not always, but the protectors will need to learn to trust the client and to trust us as the therapist. And when they do, then they will begin to yield, and we'll get to then see the exiles, the young parts of us. So relationship. The word that is often used in IFS things is befriend. We want to befriend these parts, all of them. So as we do this work and relationships are formed between the client and the parts and part-to-part relationship, the system softens. The system may appear to become less defensive, less protective. Oftentimes we have less extremes. If our extremes were here, they often become less wide, that gap. And as we do that, what happens then is more and more emerging of qualities of self-energy, and we will feel different in our body. And Karby's going to take this and share about self-energy. As a therapist, this is where we want to, where we want to really be aware of. When I'm sitting with a client, what we do as IFS therapists is we are feeling inside ourselves and also with the client. So I may have a part that's carrying an agenda. So if there's an EMDR modality on top of the IFS conceptualization, I may be thinking, oh, I really want to get to a complete session. That's carried in an agenda part of mine. So what I want to do with that is be aware of that. And what my internal process is, I ask that part would it give me space so that I can continue to be in relationship with the system of the client and the client, of course, and help the client to be in relationship with their own system. These parts within me, they step off to my left shoulder, and then they give me space, and then they watch. And that is just my own internal process. But that is part of the work is again, noticing what's happening within me as well as what's happening in the client. Karby, you want to move into the talking about self-energy?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned the managers and firefighters that their role is basically to protect, right? To protect the system,
Correct.
protect the
Yeah.
exiles. And while their intentions are good, they can be really challenging to work for us, right? For the therapists we work with sometimes.
Yeah.
And they can activate our own parts. Is that right?
Yes, very much so.
So what would you recommend for us therapists who, work with challenging clients who have firefighters and managers who work extra time and to help us work better with our clients?
Yeah. So when something gets strong in me, if it's strong, it's mine. If I feel a surge or I feel the presence of something, and you all know as therapists, we hear things inside of us when we're working. When you hear that, notice that is our own thing. There will be clients that will activate our own system, and we want to be with our system. Let our system know that we're okay, and that we're not getting hurt by this, and that those parts within us can watch, or they can step aside if they'd like. And then also it's also a trailhead to our own work. So that's why if you find yourselves getting activated by a particular client, get curious, because the bigger the activation, the bigger the wound underneath. So that's where we can do a beautiful piece of healing work with our own IFS therapist, and heal that, so that the triggering is not what it used to be. Does that answer your question, Tim?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And it's really a good segue.
Yeah.
Into self-energy.
Self-energy, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And because the only way to get self-energy is to unblend from a part. So especially in studying IFS and talking about it and talking to people, like sometimes people will experience a surge of self-energy, like in a meditation or doing yoga or doing a meditation practice. And then we think, oh, that's the way to self-energy. But it just happens that during that part's unblended and there was the experience of self-energy, but we don't get there with a modality. We don't get there with an intention. We get there from noticing parts and then asking them to make a little space so they can feel us, inviting them. If we try to wrangle them down or push them over to the side without their own volition, they're going to get stronger. And so I love this diagram, because this is one person here. We're looking at this picture and there's all of this going on in one person. And so when you have a therapist and a client in the room, you've got two of these with all the many parts. And so I have found too, the very best way to know how to really welcome a firefighter that I absolutely don't like in a client, maybe one that scares me, like a suicidal one, or one that annoys me, like one that just won't stop drinking or cutting or starving themselves, even though it doesn't make any sense. We can't logic those away. But if I work with my own and I get that felt sense of what it's like when a firefighter or a manager and me really start to feel the self, then I have the confidence, which is one of the C words, to go to a client and offer that same invitation. And the confidence can only come from my own experience, not from hearing about it. And so I had Rotem send out that sheet with the 8 C's and just kind of fleshing each one out a little bit. And, I don't want to go through that, but I think what's important is that each of the C's of self-energy could be manifested by a part. It could easily be that we have a calm part. In fact, my husband has a very lovely protector that we call Mr. Calm Guy, because he's so freaking calm. But it's not self. So that's just one example. And we have really beautiful helping parts, our therapist parts that so want to offer and help and bring healing. And if they're leading the way, as beautiful as they are, and even though they have a bit of self-energy inside, it's a completely different feeling than if they soften and let just the self lead. And that just comes from experience and feeling into it. There's just a feel, and the more you feel it, the more you know it. And so talking amongst yourselves, working inside your own system, that's how we get to that. And you can go through the list, and each of these C words could be emulated by a very skilled manager or firefighter that, or even an exile that looks this way. And so just really knowing that felt sense of just that receptivity, and whatever happens is okay. And I think that's some of the power of integrating the two, is because it's easy for a client and a therapist to maybe approach EMDR from a manager or a helping perspective. And so when it's opened up like that, the effectiveness of it's amazing. Like EMDR is amazing when it's done in the field of self-energy. So I hope that makes sense. I don't want to take too much time talking, so that there can be, some questions and some interaction.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, Karby. Thank you. And that kind of, you answered my first question about the integration, why it's so effective. And I think that you answered it beautifully, that it's the therapist and the client being in self, then EMDR just flows, as opposed to something that we're trying to force, and we're not recognizing that a client or a therapist is not in self energy, and then things will naturally get stuck.
Yes.
Yeah, and Rotem, it allows the system to lead. And that is a game changer. So, when I think about all of us and our EMDR training and follow the protocol and all that, it allows freedom to the system is informing us. When we have a question, we ask the system, which is very different from how even we were trained in school. And, we have those figure out parts. But with this work, we ask the system. So if you're in a certain section of that protocol and the system is going a different direction, it's very fluid, and you can just go right with the system and continue the BLS, and it just becomes really productive. It does not create the blocks, the defenses, like if we try to muscle it and say, well, we're going to go this way and let's container this, and we are coming towards the system as opposed to wanting to push something away.
Excellent.
It's like the smoothest interweave that you could imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So at this point, I want to open the conversation to Q&A. So we're going to get out of focus mode, and people are welcome to turn the video on, and Karby and Sue will take some questions. So if you have any questions, you can use the what is it called, hand raise, clap, whatever symbol one at a time, not everybody at the same time. If nobody has questions, we can keep talking. So okay. You're all welcome to turn your video on and ask any questions, but if there's no questions, I just wanted to point out, as I was reading the IFS skills training manual that you recommended for us to read, I noticed some correlations when I read about EMDR, and even now when Sue, when you talk about Exiles, what I thought about negative cognitions. It's I'm
Yes.
unlovable. I'm not good enough. So we're
Right.
talking in EMDR. We learned that trauma is frozen in time, and in IFS we learned that parts are frozen in time.
Mhm.
Right?
Yes. And it's interesting. Let's say I'm working with a client who has an exile and she sees the little girl under the kitchen table. Parents are fighting. It's pretty violent. There are times where you will simply say, let's go get her. And we send the client into the scene. Client's in the scene and gets that little girl and takes her out of there. So it can be that direct. It is more usually where we're asking the part, is it ready to leave that past time and space and come into the present with the now grown up of them? We let parts know that I often have clients say to parts that they are actually the part all grown up, which is a huge piece of updating for the part, because the part is usually shocked because they're stuck back 40 years ago. Is that making sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Another correlation I found is how we identify parts. So we're identifying parts by noticing thoughts, emotions, and especially body sensations,
Mhm.
right? There's a lot of emphasis on that, and that's how we find targets in EMDR. So as I was reading the IFS skills training manual, I was thinking, oh, this is how we identify parts, and this is how we find targets for EMDR. Very similar components.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. Those negative cognitions are parts. The positive cognitions are parts. Um, and then the target is a part. So when we have our lens seeing it that way, the fluidity becomes really nice.
Yeah.
And I just want to say, I think it's important to notice that the the difference between parts work and IFS is the inclusion of the self. The self to part connection is where the healing is. And so there are other ways to identify parts in EMDR, and then it's like beautiful therapist parts trying to get those other parts to behave in certain ways so the work can be healing, versus really giving space for the parts and what they're feeling to have a sense of self, a sense that there is a wise, strong, spacious leader inside that's really indescribable. Talking about self is so hard to name it because it's not a part. Self is not a part. It's another entity. It's beyond parts. And so that self to part connection all on its own is healing, whether there's a retrieval of a part, an unburdening of a part, a completion of a target, the SUDS going down to zero, any of those markers, like that self to part connection. And because so much of it is attachment wounding and relational trauma, it can just take time, just bits. It can't take too much in, almost like when someone comes out of a severe deprivation of food, they can't eat a big meal right away. They've got to just go really slowly to be able to take it in. And sometimes parts are that way. They just can't receive so much. They need just a tiny bit at a time so they can absorb it. So I think that's just an important distinction